past obliterated. For a historian, the challenge is not to add to this erasure, but rather to help reverse it. For me, the use of the word savage in my title, a racial slur which crops up all too frequently in sources, is a way to invert the expectations of both conquistadors and contemporary readers. For the indigenous travellers in my work, Europe was the savage shore, a land of incomprehensible inequality and poverty that defied pre-invasion values and logics, where resources were hoarded, children ruled great kingdoms, and common people were meant meekly to accept injustices without dissent. Where the slur occurs in sources, I will use it only when in quotation and as sparingly as possible. Writing as a white British historian, working with sources that are too often about, rather than by, native people, I make the deliberate inversion of the imperial perspective central to my approach. I cannot and should not speak for indigenous peoples, but wherever possible I will centre their voices and perspectives, allowing them to tell their own stories, valuing their knowledge and respecting the views of their descendant communities, who are of course far from homogeneous in their attitudes or outlooks. This book covers a kaleidoscope of indigenous cultures, communities, peoples and individuals, each with quite specific and equally valid ideas about what they prefer to be called. None of these terms is universal. In Mexico and much of South America, people tend to use pueblos indígenas, indigenous peoples, and the term indios, Indians, has fallen out of use because it has often been used as an insult, like calling someone a peasant. But both indio and indigenas are common in Brazil, and indio is the most common term in my manuscript sources. In what is now the United States, Indian and American Indian are usually rejected by scholars as Eurocentric and inaccurate. After all, Columbus had not reached India. But these words have at times been reclaimed. The National Congress of American Indians is the oldest and largest organization representing tribal interests in the United States, and the American Indian movement, formed as a powerful protest group in the second half of the 20th century, still has many chapters. There are also historical Indian acts and treaties which use the word Indian, giving it socio-legal and political significance. The US Census counts American Indians and Alaska Natives, putting indigenous Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders into a separate category, largely to deny them access to funding and protections. Although many people across North America still identify themselves as Indian for a variety of reasons, or even the phonetic NDN, which is a playful way of reconciling older identities with newer ones, it is increasingly considered to be derogatory. Native American has become popular in recent decades, but is challenged by many native peoples as centering colonial racial categories and validating the settler state by implying that the concept of America existed even before the arrival of Europeans. The term can also exclude people who are not Americans in the way we most often use the term, enfranchised citizens of the United States of America. In Canada, Aboriginal is the official government designation for the original inhabitants of the region, who tend to prefer to call themselves Indigenous, Inuit, who are not typically Indian in legal terms, Métis, or perhaps most often First Nations. The similar First Peoples has also gained popularity in some quarters, removing the potentially problematic implication that nations must be recognized by states. Of all these terms, only Indigenous is generally seen as relatively neutral, though Native has been reclaimed in recent years. The former is the UN's favoured term, although even this falls foul of some Canadian groups who were oppressed under the French as Indigenes. So what route should be taken through this linguistic minefield? As all of these paths and preferences are valid, I think the only solution is one that defers to Indigenous peoples themselves. There are far too many uncomfortable associations for me to stride into this field and start classifying people like Columbus. It is not for me to say what people should call themselves. So I will respect the preferences of particular groups and favour their preferred terms where not limited by my sources. Indians will appear only to reflect the 16th century texts when they speak of Indios. And Indigenous Americans has been used in my title as the clearest way to articulate the geographical scope of the book for readers. Much of the current generation uses native or indigenous